Did you know that Old English, the language of Beowulf, is about as similar to modern English as modern English is to Spanish? And yet, if we take just a few hundred years, look at Shakespeare's Hamlet, written around 1600, we can find in it nearly every single word and sentence structure that we would use today. So how did English go from sounding like German to becoming so radically different from itself? And then come back again? What happened to all the French loan words that should be in there somewhere? And how is it that Chaucer sounds like Shakespeare, but Shakespeare sounds nothing like Dickens? Hello and welcome to a journey through time. Before we get started, I'd like to say thank you to my supporters for their support and to everyone else for watching this video. Please leave a comment below with your thoughts, suggestions, or corrections. And now let's get started. We often think of language as a static thing, but languages are actually constantly changing. There are thousands of languages in the world today, and none of them have stayed the same. Languages evolve over time because humans do. Sometimes changes happen very quickly and sometimes they happen slowly. English has gone through many radical changes in its history, most of which can be dated back to when England was invaded by some other people. When invaders show up, there are three possible ways that the native speakers of two languages can respond. They can learn the invader's language, usually because it is easier than continuing to speak their own language while being threatened by an invading army. In these circumstances, speakers of one language who learn another language don't usually become bilingual, but instead they will adopt a few words and phrases and eventually switch to speaking the new language almost exclusively. This is what happened with Latin and French, although many Germanic tribes spoke various dialects of what we now call Old English. After centuries of French domination, those dialects were nearly completely replaced by French. The only reason that English survived at all is because there was no one language, but rather many dialects, and the dialects in the far north of England were relatively isolated from the French speakers in the south. Those northern dialects eventually became what we call Old English. That's why Old English is closer to Old German than to Old French, even though Old French was spoken in England for a longer period of time and had much more influence on later English. The second way that two languages can interact is for them to influence each other equally. But this isn't really relevant to English literature because no major foreign language had this kind of equal relationship with English until English became a global language. The third way is for the invaders to adopt the language of the natives. This didn't happen until Danish Vikings began to settle in northern England in the late 9th century. Even then, it wasn't immediate, and the Danes didn't switch to Old English right away. Instead, they introduced their own language into the mix. For several centuries, the Northumbrian dialect of Old English continued to be used alongside Old Norse, but the two languages influenced each other greatly. Old Norse had a big impact on vocabulary. Many common words like husband and finger are derived from Old Norse. As Old English and Old Norse were fairly similar, their grammar and syntax also changed together. One major difference between the two languages was the lack of inflection in Old Norse compared to Old English. Old Norse nouns and adjectives did not change form based on their function in a sentence, but in Old English they did. After centuries of interaction, Old English lost much of its inflectional endings and became much simpler, and eventually it turned into what we call Middle English. So far, these are the only three ways that languages can change over time, but the most interesting way that languages can change happens when multiple languages come into contact with each other. It is called language shift, and it is exactly what happened during the Norman conquest of England in 1066. The French nobility dominated the English court and educated class for the next few centuries. But unlike the French-speaking invaders before them, the English people had no interest in learning French. In fact, King Henry II, the first Plantagenet King of England, couldn't speak a word of English, and yet, despite the political and social pressure, English didn't die out. Instead, English and French influenced each other greatly. French loanwords entered the language and English speakers began to adopt French sentence structures. Because Old French and Old English were both heavily inflected languages, their grammars were already fairly similar. In fact, a text written in Old English could easily be mistaken for Old French if you took out some of the unique words. And since Old English and Old Norse had simplified the grammar even further, that meant that Middle English, the language of Chaucer and the Canterbury Tales, sounds so much like modern English because it already was like modern English. There's one big problem with this story, though. If Old French had such a huge impact on English, why aren't there any loanwords left from that period in English? Why doesn't the English language have words like bonjour or merci? Well, it does. Have you ever heard of the Great Vowel Shift? In the mid 1400s, the pronunciation of long vowels changed dramatically. The vowel sounds in words like name, gate, and house all shifted up by one sound. This made the language much harder to understand, especially for people like William Caxton, who invented the printing press in England. Caxton standardized English spelling so that the written language would match the spoken language. That's why spelling in English is so screwy. It doesn't match up with our pronunciation. This is because Old French loan words had French spellings, not English spellings. So words like haunt and fort were spelled as they sounded in French, not as they came to sound in English. Eventually, most of the French loan words were replaced with native English words. You can even see this happening in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. In one section he writes, I read thee, madam, weigh not his words sore, for he is falls in his tales as here is for to see. He's telling someone not to trust what a jester says because jesters are known for lying. But in Middle English, the word false had two meanings. In this case, it means both literally false and untrue, but it also means corrupt or immoral. Another Middle English word for untrue would have been Giles, which is where we got the word guile. These are just a few examples of how the English language was changing at this time, and it's fascinating stuff. But just remember that all of these changes happened gradually over hundreds of years. Nothing happened suddenly or dramatically. And now that we've established that, let's talk about Shakespeare, because that's exactly what happened. Shakespeare lived in a period of rapid change in England. Not only was the English language changing as it always does, but England was going through a massive shift in power and wealth and culture. The Renaissance, Reformation, and Scientific Revolution all happened during Shakespeare's lifetime, and all of them impacted him and his work. His plays were extremely popular, and many of his contemporaries wrote satires and parodies of his work. But as the centuries passed, less and less people remembered who Shakespeare was. In the Victorian era, his work began to be seen as pure and classical and representative of the greatest periods of English literature, high culture, great art. Shakespeare became a symbol of England. And if Shakespearean English sounds so strange to us, it's because it was romanticized into seeming archaic. This is why Shakespeare sounds like he's speaking Middle English. But the English language didn't stop changing. People continued to speak, write, and publish books in early modern English, the language of Shakespeare, for another 200 years. But then something new happened. No longer was the dominant language of England being replaced by another language, and it was no longer replacing another language. It was simply evolving into modern English. During the Industrial Revolution, people were writing books, newspapers, magazines, pamphlets, anything you can imagine, faster than ever before. New slang developed and spread around the country. Londoners and Americans adapted their languages to reflect their new lifestyles and experiences. Charles Dickens was one of the first authors to make use of these new linguistic tools. If Shakespeare sounds like Chaucer, and Shakespeare is considered the epitome of English literature, and Dickens sounds like a modern person, then we must conclude that Shakespeare doesn't sound like Dickens. In other words, English continued to change after Shakespeare's death. His language became the language of the past, and now his works are taught in schools, read by academics, and performed on stages all over the world. It's hard to believe that English hasn't changed at all since 1600, but it's true. Shakespeare wrote in the same language that we did 400 years ago, and that's pretty incredible. Thanks for watching. See you next time.